like to say is capitalism that has become rotten ripe. The term imperialism comes from so what Lenin is describing here is imperialism based on the requirements of the European movement for socialism. That's where he's entering in this discussion. His discussion, as becomes rather obvious, I think, to us now, is based on how Europe has to develop in this struggle against capitalism. The term imperialism comes from the word empire, which can be defined as the complete domination of territories and peoples by a foreign state power. During the era of the First Imperialist World War that was fought to divide the world among several European bandits, the term imperialism was used to define political and economic features of capitalist-dominated European social behavior and reality. Lenin's definition of imperialism was one of several at the time, but has come to dominate the understanding of politically active Europeans and other anti-imperialists to this day. According to Lenin, Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, quote, imperialism is capitalism at that stage of development at which the dominance of monopolies and finance capital is established, in which the export of capital has acquired pronounced importance, in which the division of the world among the international trust has begun, in which the division of all territories of the globe among the biggest capitalist powers has been completed, unquote. In imperialism and the split in socialism, Lenin declares, quote, we have to begin with as precise and full a definition of imperialism as possible. Imperialism is a specific historical stage of capitalism. Its specific character is threefold. Imperialism is 1, monopoly capitalism, 2, parasitic or decaying capitalism, 3, moribund capitalism, unquote. Indeed, it is certainly true that Lenin has described certain features of capitalism. However, Lenin is wrong about imperialism being the highest stage of capitalism. The discussion of imperialism in Europe was a response to contradictions being experienced primarily by Europeans in Europe itself. The foray into an inclusion of the partitioning of the world and the intensification of colonization was to contribute to the definition of European reality. It was not a discussion of the reality of Africans and the colonized. This was not a discussion about us. Lenin characterized himself as a Marxist, a revolutionary whose worldview was fashioned by his acceptance of revolutionary theory and conclusions advanced by Karl Marx. We African internationalists have found particular interest in a critical insight of Marx that was clearly not understood as such by Marx's followers or by Marx himself. Again, we return to the brilliant insight of this quote that we often cite from Capital, the quote that Marx himself did not recognize the significance of. Quote, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief mementa of primitive accumulation. This is where it kicks off. Again, what he's talking about is defining the significance of this. This that he talks about is to show the significance of development inside Europe. It doesn't say anything, it doesn't even go so far as to say to the poor people or what was happening to in the East Indies or what happened to Africa or anything like that. What it meant for African economics, what it meant for the economy of India, of the East Indies. It didn't even say that. This is what he's talking about, what it means to Europe. In the same work, Marx also explains, though not intentionally, the obvious contradiction impacting the relationship between white people, including workers and Africans and other oppressed peoples. This is the contradiction that is responsible for a commonality of cross-class or national interests within European society, and one of Marx's most important statements, quote, whilst the cotton industry introduced child slavery in England, it gave in the United States a stimulus to transformation of the earlier, more or less patriarchal slavery into a system of commercial exploitation. In fact, the veiled slavery of the wage workers in Europe needed for its pedestal slavery pure and simple in the New World. There, unquote. There is no little irony attached to the fact that Karl Marx wrote much of Capital while being supported financially by his friend and collaborator Friedrich Engels. Engels received his income from his father, a bourgeois factory owner whose wealth was deprived from cotton and textile mills supplied by plantations in the Caribbean. Stated simply, Marx's work on the plight of the working class that promised the future to the white workers of the world was financed by the labor of enslaved Africans who constituted what Marx would refer to as the primitive accumulation of capital, the beginning of the process, equivalent in political economy to original sin in theology. African internationalists are historical materialists whose investigation and analysis of the world has its starting point in an examination of the capitalist-dominated world from the objective reality and experiences of Africans and the vast majority of the peoples on the planet, including white or European people. It is clear to us that imperialism is not a product of capitalism. It is not capitalism developed to its highest stage. Indeed, capitalism is a product of imperialism. If anything, capitalism is imperialism developed to its highest stage, not the other way around. The imperialism defined by Lenin, and this is not, just a simple statement. I mean, everything that we've been defining up to now, everything, shows that the reality that they are defining is one that was given rise to by oppressed and exploited and African people. That's what created Europe. Europe didn't create the rest of us. That's what created Europe. And that's the fundamental thing that we're saying, that the real dependency is in the colonizer. And to the extent the colonized can extricate ourselves from this relationship, it becomes obvious. We saw the assumption of the ascendancy of socialism, and it was an assumption based on, like a certain kind of Marxist fundamentalist understanding. And we saw, the first so-called socialist revolution happened in 1917 in Russia, where socialists seized power. Now, the seizure of power by the socialists did not meet the formula that had been described by Marx for socialism coming into the world. Even Lenin, even the Bolsheviks who took power in Russia did not believe that what they were doing met the definition of what Marx talked about. In fact, even after they seized power, Lenin kept waiting for the real socialist revolution to begin, like in Germany, one of the other highly developed capitalist countries, but it didn't. It didn't happen there because the material basis for the rise of socialism did not exist. The political conditions for socialists to seize power did exist. And socialists seized power in Russia. But the Germans didn't happen, Hungary didn't happen, the other places where they looked for revolution to happen in the highly industrialized capitalist countries did not occur. That never happened. And I think it's really important for us to understand that it never happened. So when people talk to us today about how socialism failed in Russia or some other place, even when they talk about China, because the Chinese Revolution was based on some of the same assumptions. Even though Mao Zedong had to break from certain Marxist assumptions about the workers and went instead to the peasants, because that was the majority of the toilers in China to seize power. And then again, you have socialists having seized power and trying to initiate various kinds of socialist transformation that ran into their limitations. When you look at what's happened, say like in what they call socialist Russia, Eastern Europe, the Soviet bloc, etc., over a period of time, what you saw was they were able to make certain kinds of reform based on socialists being in power. They were able to take land away from the landlords, transfer land to the peasants. They were able to change certain relations of production so that now people like peasants were able to go to school, where only the nobility was able to do that in the past, which meant they could get more doctors because more people were doing that. The peasants were able to attain positions they never thought possible before under feudalism. But pretty soon what happened was they exhausted all the capacity existing inside of Russia itself for development. The Russians did not have the advantage that Marx had of the Caribbean slavery producing the ability for him to attend libraries in Germany and London, etc., to write capital. They didn't have that capacity. So pretty soon it ran into its limitations. And what happened when it ran into its limitations? We saw it begin to collapse. And if you want to know how it's going to look for capitalism worldwide, now increasingly the capitalist world is running into its limitations based on the barriers that's being presented to it by the ability, the struggle of the peoples of the world to live, which means that we have to extricate ourselves from this relationship. So soon you will see the U.S. and all these other countries now having to try to struggle and live and exist without these resources. That's one of the reasons such great desperation is being expressed in these permanent wars that's going on. That's one of the reasons you see splits within the European societies, Brexit and other kinds of contradictions emerging, et cetera, because all of it rests upon this fault line of the colonial domination of the peoples of the world. African internationalism told us that. So, okay, and that's important, because otherwise you end up fighting forever, trying to make Greece or Portugal or the Wall Street occupiers the basis of revolutionary transformation. And you'll always hear the Wall Street occupiers and people, where are the black guys, right? Trying to understand why we aren't there. And when we should be answering and where are the white guys, right? You know, when we are engaged in the struggle on the ground to destroy the capitalist system. Okay. So the imperialist defined by Lenin has as its foundation the primitive accumulation spoken of by Marx. Finance, capital, the export of capital, monopoly, etc. are all articulations of a political economy rooted in parasitism and based on historically savage subjugation of most of humanity. I hear oftentimes some of my most astute, erudite, anti-imperialist comrades who continue to tell us the problem, finance, capital, all capitalism. It rests upon this foundation of the slavery, of our enslavement. So you can mess around talking about financial capital, or you can talk about overturning the system through the liberation of the oppressed and colonized peoples of the world. And we've chosen to do that. So let's see. Okay, I'm on 298. And unlike Marx and Lenin, we African internationalists deny that there has ever been anything progressive about capitalism. Never, never, never. Capitalism was born in disrepute of the rapes, massacres, occupations, genocide, colonialism, and every despicable act humans are capable of inflicting. Capitalism was not responsible for some great, otherwise unimaginable leap in production, which, quote unquote, despite its contradictions, resulted in human progress and enlightenment. That, despite its contradiction, is the, what do you call that kind of clause that, you know, people make? It's, it's a recognition that it's done horrible things, but despite that, we have this. What capitalism did was to rip the vast majority of humanity out of the productive process in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Australia, and what has come to be known as the Americas. The hundreds of millions dead due to the slave trade and slavery itself. The millions exterminated everywhere Europeans ventured. These are people whose hands were forever removed from a relationship with nature that would result in production. And certainly will have resulted in production for the peoples there. What could have happened if you don't understand this parasitism? Then you move with the assumption that without this intervention by Europe, the so-called Indians, the indigenous peoples here, would have been forever roaming the plains, living in teepees and hunting buffaloes, etc. It presupposes that the people would not have been engaged in production to benefit their own existence. And sometimes we have some anti-capitalists back to nature kind of forces who would put the so-called Indians back on hunting buffaloes because that's the pure way of life. But the fact is that the production and reproduction of life is common to all humanity, to all human beings. The indigenous people, we have to assume, because it's totally unreasonable not to assume that they would have been involved in developing their societies based on their needs and requirements. And the forces of production definitely would have been enhanced without this intervention by Europe. And the fact is that much of what came to be known as science was expropriated just like from the indigenous peoples here. As well as it was some other colonized peoples of the world, and colonized, etc. Europeans achieved their national identity by way of this bloody process. This is not something that only happened a long time ago. The world's peoples are suffering the consequences of capitalism's emergence right now. Locked in colonies and the indirect rule of NeoColonialism, restricted to lives characterized by brutality, ignorance, and violence in the barrios of the Americas and other internal colonies characterized as Indian reservations and black ghettos, kept under the paranoid, nuclear-backed, armed-to-the-teeth watch of military forces born of a state power that has its origin in protecting the relationship between capitalism and its imperial pedestal. Capitalism has been the absolute factor in restricting our production and development. It has concentrated productive capacity in the hands of the world's minority European population that sits atop the pedestal of our oppressive reality. Capitalism is not not the good, progressive force that is the precursor to something better for humanity. Capitalism is not the good, progressive force that is the precursor to something better for humanity. Capitalism was a disaster that rescued Europe from a diseased, feudal existence at the expense of the Africans and the rest of the world. In the 17th century, Galileo, an Italian scientist, ran afoul of the Catholic Church with his claim that the earth circumnavigated the sun, as opposed to the prevailing view in feudal Europe supported by the church that the earth was the center of the universe. Of course, they could have gone to Mali and got an extraordinary explanation of how the solar system really functioned, but they couldn't. The white left has always been locked into a worldview that places the location of Europeans at the center of the universe. If this were not the case, Marx would have been forced to declare that the road to socialism is painted black, the destruction of the pedestal upon which all capitalist activity occurs, not some maturation of contradictions within European capitalist society resting upon the pedestal, is the key to overturning imperialist capitalism. The destruction of the pedestal upon which all capitalist activity occurs, not some maturation of contradictions within European capitalist society resting upon the pedestal, is the key to overturning imperialist capitalism. I'm going to read just a couple of more paragraphs and open it up. In an earlier work, title, we keep saying in title, but the word should be title, The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx made this startling admission, quote, direct slavery is just as much the pivot of bourgeois industry as machinery, credits, etc. Without slavery, you have no cotton. Without cotton, you have no modern industry. It is slavery that gave the colonists their value. It is the colonists that created world trade. And it is world trade that is the precondition of large-scale industry. I want to stop here just for a moment because I think the following is important too, but I want to understand this. He says, without slavery, you have no cotton. Without cotton, you have no modern industry. It is slavery that gave the colonists their value. It is the colonists that created world trade. And it is world trade that is the precondition for large-scale industry. There's no mention here. There's not even a suggestion. Without slavery, you have no impoverished Africa. You have no diseased Africa. There's no discussion here about anything that this enslavement, this attack on Africa did to Africa, to African economic life. All of this presupposes the value of slavery to the development of Europe, not to the assault on Africa and the rest of us. And that's an important point. And this is something that we have to even learn how to think, to take our brains away from certain, what has become norms, certain norms of how the world is to be viewed from the perspective of the oppressed. That's why philosophy is such a critical thing, because when you talk about philosophy, you're talking about identifying our place and destiny in the world. Without slavery, North America, the most progressive of countries, will be transformed into a patriarchal country. Wipe North America off the map of the world, and you will have anarchy. The complete decay of modern commerce and civilization cause slavery to disappear, and you will have wiped America off the map of nations, unquote. What an excellent formula for the overthrow of capitalism. The slavery of today is comprised of the colonial, subject, and oppressed peoples of the world. The existence of our party and the convening of our sixth Congress are part of the trajectory to cause slavery to disappear and, objectively, to achieve the consequences predicted by Marx. African internationalism has brought us to a different understanding than that held by Marx and Lenin regarding the way forward in the struggle against capitalism. It is rooted in our recognition, supported by the quotes from Marx above, that it was imperialism that gave birth to capitalism and not the other way around. Lenin stated that imperialism is capitalism that is characterized in part by parasitism. But from what we have already seen from the pen of Marx and what we know from our own experiences and historical investigation, capitalism was born parasitic. That is the meaning of the enslavement, colonization, and annexation of other peoples and other countries and peoples by Europe. Capitalism was born parasitic. Lenin discovers capitalism becoming parasitic as part of its development. And we're saying that's how it was born. A direct line of connection, a unity of opposites, a dialectical relationship exists between the vast majority of the planet and Europe and Europeans. There is no other explanation for the vast differences in the conditions of existence of Europeans and the rest of us. The original peoples of the Americas, Australia, Canada, the Caribbean, much of Asia, the Middle East, and everywhere the U.S. and Europe are currently engaged in bloody wars and intrigues represent what Marx has objectified with the term primitive accumulation. Indeed, the current irreversible crisis of imperialism is the result of the imperialist pedestal, the very foundation of capitalism, freeing itself from the supporting role of the capitalist edifice. Objectively, this is the meaning of Afghanistan, Iraq, Palestine, Venezuela, Bolivia, and other countries where the people are attempting to liberate themselves from the yoke of empire. It is in self-defense that the U.S. and its partners are engaged in every effort, no matter how brutal or duplicitous, to protect the capitalist status quo. So I want to go ahead and stop now, and so that we can have some room for discussion. But I do implore everybody to read this, and I'm hoping that this discussion that we're having now will make it less likely for people to be intimidated. Sometimes I know we're talking to the workers, and I know that the working people, running into language and stuff like that, that presupposes a level of education that's a preserve of the petty bourgeoisie or the bourgeoisie itself, and so. But you can't be intimidated by it. You have to read it over and over and over again, and soon it becomes yours. Because this is what we have to take into our communities, into the prison wings, everywhere we go. We have to take this so that the African masses can understand. Because the person who is suffering brutality at the hands of police in Everton West, in Gauteng in South Africa, or in the 5th Ward of Houston, Texas, or North St. Louis, must be able to connect that brutality with the thing that holds this whole system together and with their significance. The people, the working people must understand their significance in this whole struggle to overturn a system that can only produce the kind of violence, poverty that we see, that destroys the planet itself if it is left without a challenge. So this is why we have to understand this. So I'm calling on you to really study this. And people in the party, you have a responsibility to understand this and take it out into the world. Uhuru.
Yeah. Let's salute our leadership, Chairman Amalia Shitella, for that amazing study. It is now time to open up with questions from our audience and online viewers. We want to appreciate everyone who's tuning in via Facebook and YouTube, and also appreciate all of your engagement. Please continue to invite your friends and family to the study and share widely on all of your social media platforms. We want to acknowledge that we have viewers from Chicago, Illinois, St. Louis, Missouri, Boston, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Trinidad, Columbus, Ohio, Atlanta, Georgia, Clarksville, Tennessee, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that's right? Detroit, Michigan, Kingston, Jamaica, Huntsville, Alabama, Oakland, California, San Diego, California, Tampa, Florida, and Clearwater, Florida. Salutes from Chairwoman Penny Hess of the African People Solidarity Committee says, saluting Chairman Amalia Shitella from African People Solidarity Committee in St. Louis. Camelia Boudreau from Columbus, Ohio says, respect and love for the chairman. I remember hearing him on the first Dead Prez album. Raymond Moses from Trinidad says, Uhuru comrades from Trinidad in the Caribbean. And Trent Thompson in Kingston, Jamaica says, salute, and also asks the question, Chairman, can you explain how socialism works and how the distribution of wages are structured for the worker?
Socialism works by the people who produce the value, the workers, the laborers, ourselves, becoming collective owners of the process of producing. We are the collective owners and therefore the collective leaders of that society. And the wages under fully developed socialism, well, we say socialism fully developed, of course, is something that matures into what is known as communism, where classless societies, where there are no workers and no bosses or anything like that. And so how the wages will look in the process of developing is not something that's easy to say, because it's going to be uneven all over the world because of what we have to recapture in terms of resources owed to Africa, how that's going to look in Africa, how that's going to look in different places. That will be determined by conditions and the efficiency that we achieve in the process of moving resources where they need to be. Because when we talk about socialism, we're talking about a world occurrence, not something that's going to happen just in Jamaica or going to happen in Brazil or some other enclave. Socialism actually, the existence of the African Socialist International makes it possible finally to get rid of this apparent contradiction about socialism in one country. It doesn't have to be socialism in one country. The African Revolution, African Socialist International, gives us the ability to initiate a socialist revolution in various places around the world that will become the dominant economy, the defining economy of the world. Just like capitalism is a defining economy of the world, despite the fact that most of the people don't have advantage of what's supposed to be capitalist production. And then, of course, the objective of communism is to achieve a capacity where people will achieve what they need. Will achieve, that is to say, they will, to the Marxist saying about to each according to need and from each according to ability. That is something that will be able to happen under socialism. So the issue of wages, and I think it's really important when we talk about socialism to recognize that socialism is not communism. It is that juncture where there's still classes in society, and the working class has achieved, has overturned the state, the bourgeois colonial state, the imperialist state, and the working class has itself become the state. The working class in arms become the state power, and giving us the ability to restructure that society, restructure production, and which is going to be necessary, and also to defend the revolution from the existing thugs, imperialists, hirelings, and that's still going to be there until they're ultimately crushed. So, I mean, that might not be, the kind of response he was given, but it's not going to be $15 an hour over a number of years. In fact, the working class now becomes the owning class, becomes the owning class. And those people who never worked, stockbrokers and other kinds of parasites, and even the preacher's going to have to get a job. Because they too function as parasites. You go to work, and so everything changes at that point. Uhuru.
Uhuru. We have a question from Morty from Richmond, Virginia. He asks, Uhuru Chairman, can the current relationship between our Africa and the People's Republic of China be described as neocolonial?
It has certain features of neocolonialism. I don't know if it can be described that in absolute terms. The problem that we're looking at is that it's difficult to say our Africa right now, because it's not our Africa right now. What it is 54 different Africas under 54 different colonial kinds of setups. And so China has entered into relationships with each of them. And China, of course, and I think it's really important to understand this, China is working in its own interest. And when we say it's working in its own interest, it's also working in its own interest in contradiction with U.S. and other typical colonial interests. And so there's room there for us to understand and take advantage of these contradictions that exist between China and the other imperialist forces, and to build an independent Africa, an African economy. We're going to have to build a revolutionary party that all over Africa and in the African world. I mean, China, I would imagine, doesn't have resources equivalent of, a third of what is there in Africa in terms of material resources. The big resource that China has is people and organization and philosophy. And China has pulled together and united China. That China wasn't always united. In fact, China's still in the struggle to unite China. And the British and the U.S. are trying to keep that from happening in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and other places like that. But it has achieved that kind of unity. And then because it achieved that unity, and because it worked on what was characterized at the moment as socialist principles, it was able to create a rapid kind of production. And because it was clear on China's objective and not objectives that were able to be determined by the quote-unquote West, it played a pretty good hand in being able to develop and participate in much of the so-called world economy without, in fact, the world leaped into it. The so-called West, they thought they had easy prey in China. And they went in, they were going to loot China, and ended up the rabbit had the gun, and now the hunter is on the run. And that's what China was. China was the rabbit that they were all going to come in and devour. And now they're afraid of China because China was clear on its own objectives. Africa has no objectives to be clear of. African Socialist International does. And that's the crucial thing. That's why the African Socialist International is so important. And in the process, we will build, a united capacity to make revolution, to free our people, to free Africa. And so the resource of Africa will belong to Africa, and there will be an our Africa. Uhuru.
Thank you, Chairman. Zoputan in Atlanta, Georgia asks, does the chairman think that Trump will be removed from office?
I'm sorry, that hasn't been something that has occupied much of our attention. What we see happening with Trump is a struggle between different sectors of the ruling class. Like there's a sector of the bourgeoisie that wants to, if they can, they'll remove him. And that would be an ultimate goal if they can do that. But if they can't do that, the objective is to cripple his regime, to make it incapable of carrying out its program, to protect the status quo as it existed within the so-called Atlanticist group, to keep Russia out, which Trump has invited in, to keep waging this struggle against China, which is really important because China is the big contender right now. And they're afraid of China. That's the reality. And those are some of the things. And and also to maintain some of the trade relations and the terms of trade relations that came from the Atlanticist grouping that is responsible for how over the last 70 years or so capitalism has existed in the whole world. And on each side of the Atlantic in terms of Europe, this is how the main imperialist forces have driven the thing and set up relationships and stuff like that. And Trump has violated that. NATO, UN, all of these came under assault from Trump. And even the willingness to pursue certain kinds of wars to maintain the status quo. The relationship with Russia, Trump did this. And so you got a sector of the bourgeoisie that's fighting. If they could get rid of Trump, they'll get rid of him. But at least the minimum they want to do is to cripple Trump. The cripple so that he won't be able to carry out the mission of his regime. I think it's important for us to understand that because there are some people who are Africans who, hate Trump with a passion because, unlike, Bernie who might call you Mr. Nigger, Trump just call you nigger. And so people are confused by this apparent distinction between the two of them, but we still live under colonial domination. That's why theory is so important. You still live under colonial domination, whether it's a nice slave master or a naughty slave master, you're still enslaved. And so there's a fight that's going on between different sectors of the ruling class for control of the state apparatus. So what we have to do is build and take advantage of this crisis between them, not assuming that we got any interest in either side, except for how one side might be played against the other, how we might be able to take some advantage of it. But Trump may or may not be removed from office. If he's removed from office or not, it's not going to benefit us at all. There's no benefit that we're going to get, either removing Trump from office or keeping Trump in office. And one of the main forces in the anti-Trump struggle around this whole impeachment thing, again, is this guy, what's his name? We just mentioned him early on, Schiff. And Schiff is the one who's talking about Trump has to go, we won't survive without Trump. And at the same time, he's saying that he's destroying the African community in St. Louis. He's part of it, and then preparing to destroy the lives of people all around the world with this national geospatial intelligence thing. So, you got imperialism, whether it's Trump or Obama or Schiff, Uhuru,
You're heard, Chairman. We have a comment from Rashada Parks in St. Petersburg. Says, thank you for the tears that flow when one is instilled with understanding, invested with truth in a world instilled with confusion and lies. Nasir Alamin, who is in Kuwait, says, Uhuru, watching from Kuwait, timely insight as always. We have Trent Thompson from Kingston, Jamaica. You answered his question. He says, thank you for your response, Chairman. And then Ra'a in Atlanta, Georgia asked, what can reparations be other than money or others that have, what can reparations be other than money or what has been sourced from the past and present looting of resources from oppressed people globally?
Well, ultimately, we have a situation where the reparations have been achieved. It was achieved, if you want to call it that, by the Jews subsequent to the Holocaust, as it's characterized. And but this was a reparations that was designed to give resources and power to the Europeans who now occupy this critical place in the Middle East, critical in terms of the movement of, because much of the petroleum resources of the world are located there. And it gave Europe an ability to put Europeans there to protect their interests. And they gave them an ability to fund it, to give it a tremendous amount of resources to fund it, and to create an ideological foundation for what they were doing that has religious characteristics and other kind of moral assumptions tied to it. And this, by countries that stood aside while the Jews were being killed in Europe in every instance, and who never attacked Hitler or the Germans to save the Jews, and who denied Jews even entry into the United States and other countries while this stuff was going on. We really had policies opposing that. I want to make it clear. And some of the great heroes, especially in this country and in France in particular, and other places all over. You can't find a place in Europe at that time where people who came to power or associated with power were not tied in some way or another to the Nazis and the extermination of Jews. But none of them have to pay the price for that, except they send resources in there to protect the same capitalist system that effectively was responsible for the extermination of the Jews in Germany. So that's what we've seen. Now, when we talk about, there's a pittance, as we know, given to the Japanese, 1989, by the Reagan administration. Do you think Ronald Reagan loved Japanese? Not likely. And this had to do with economic interests of the United States as they saw it, and the growing economic development of Japan, which was at one time highly industrialized even before now. And so there were the economic interests there. For us, the question of reparations, we will really delude ourselves if we think that there is some way that reparations can be given to us in a fashion that allows the capitalist system to continue to function. In every instance that we're talking about up to now, it benefited the capitalist system to give what they call reparations. And they will give something that they call reparations in this country, depending on how profound the crisis gets, depending on how the movement of our people grows. That's why you see this discussion happening now in the political electoral. I mean, just a few years ago when we started reparation work, we were considered a lunatic French for even saying reparations. Now, people who are running for president of the United States talking about reparations. So there's a possibility that this is an attempt to buy off a sector of the African population in the struggle, in this instance, in the electoral process. And some instances just keep us hanging on. One day we'll get reparations in this foul social system, right, that was built off taking everything we've got, that somehow they're going to give us something to keep it afloat. We believe in reparations, but we believe in the reparations ultimately that will come as a consequence or as a part of the process of overturning the social system itself. And so for us, the critical question is taking reparations into our communities, everywhere, even into the prisons and everywhere. Reparations as something that's due us because of what Europe has done to us, and the whole capitalist system was built off our enslavement. Therefore, they owe us every damn thing. And how do you get everything? You get everything by capturing state power, by capturing the political power. That's why we're organizing and then turning the masses loose around this question. So the question that was raised was what about how does reparations, what was that question? How was it phrased?
It was phrased, what can reparations be other than money?
Yeah, well, reparations is damn near everything, because we are already looking at what docks are going to be leaving the U.S. and other places in Europe that we can load resources and factories and stuff like that, and taking it back to Africa. And, it has to mean really repair. And Africa cannot play catch up. There's no catch up. We've already created everything. We don't have to do this again. That would be doing it again. We're not doing it again. We've already produced all the wealth. So Africans and the peoples of the world will have to come to this new mall. After the revolution, America will become a mall that peoples of the world will have an opportunity to come take our resources and put them where they need to be so that the peoples can live, including peoples here, the indigenous peoples themselves. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Well, thank you, Chairman. Did you want to say anything before we close out?
Well, you have something to say, don't you?
Yes. I got
Okay.
announcements. All right. Well, Uhuru, Chairman, thank you so much for that powerful study. And because of time, we want everyone to know that if your question was not answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you and make sure that the Chairman sees your question. This study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, Winning the War of Ideas. For your worldwide revolutionary news and analysis, visit theburningspear.com. For revolutionary radio, dynamic shows, and music by Africans all around the world, tune into Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via the Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. Did you unite with what you heard today and want to learn more about how you can get involved with the African People's Socialist Party? Visit apspuhuru.org for all information regarding how you can apply. Order your copy of Chairman Omali Eshitelo's latest book, Vanguard, The Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, the political report to the 7th Congress at burningspearmarketplace.com. That's the book that the Chairman was reading from on today. It's almost here. Register today for the African People's Socialist Party's 2020 plenary following our 7th Congress, happening February 1st through the 3rd in St. Petersburg, Florida, themed Vanguard Up, Unity of Theory and Practice. The plenary will feature a keynote presentation from our chairman, reports from our party's departments and organizations, workshops on socialism, reparations, African internationalism, and so much more. You can register and read the call to the plenary today at apspplenary.org. All registrants will receive a digital and physical copy of the chairman's political report to the party's first 7th Congress plenary. On March 27th to 29th, 2020, the African National Women's Organization will be hosting the Black Women's Convention, Sisters United for Revolution, in Philadelphia. Registration is open for this dynamic event at anwobwc.eventbrite.com. Come see the leadership of revolutionary African women on the front lines for revolution. Featured here will be presentations from African women in our party and movement, workshops, culture, and much more. For more information about the convention, visit convention.anwouhuru.org. The Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations is hosting its 4th annual electoral campaign school in St. Louis, Missouri at Aquaba Hall, located at 4101 West Florissant Ave, on April 10th through the 12th, themed The Ballot and the Bullet. This school is a means by which the coalition opens up a new front of struggle for Black self-determination within the U.S. and elsewhere. The school will teach ordinary Africans, workers, activists, women, and youth how to run for office. The weekend of events will include presentations from members of the BIB Steering Committee and other special guests. Stay tuned to blackisbackcoalition.org for more details, including registration and our list of featured speakers. Thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study, and like and subscribe because next weekend we'll be broadcasting the party's plenary. So like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube. Uhuru.